Good evening. You're on the smoking section with Stephen Helfer, and unfortunately, we have not been able to find my introductory music for the show. But as they say, the show must go on. And the latest in tobacco information or activity, Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights was very active in tabling in Harvard Square and also encouraging people to email the FDA regarding the proposal to eliminate almost all of the nicotine in cigarettes. And the FDA was taking public comments up until July 16th, which was Monday at midnight. And I think Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights was able to get a lot of people, and when I say a lot of people, I would say we had cards made up, which we sent to the FDA, and we also encouraged people to email. And so I would say we probably got about 150 at the most, between 100, well, certainly at least 100 comments into the FDA on their public policy or their public comment page. And people are somewhat kind of disinclined to do things like that because there is this attitude, well, what difference does one email make, or what difference does one letter make to a large public agency or government agency like the FDA? But my view is that every political action, no matter how small, has a consequence. And when you consider the investment, and it takes, let's say, 90 seconds to 2 minutes to send an email, one's investment is very small. So obviously it's not going to change the course of history, but it is going to do something. And I think the big problem with the smoking issue in terms is that we have to get people who smoke and people who object to being bullied and harassed to not say, well, it's a waste of time to email the FDA, or it's a waste of time to call my legislator, or the politicians don't listen to me when I speak. The politicians definitely listen. You may not be able to persuade them. There may be other people talking louder, more other people, but I think doing something is certainly a lot better than doing simply saying to oneself it doesn't make any difference. So I think we had a fairly successful campaign up until July 16, which was the closing of the public comment period. But we'll see how this FDA proposal goes out. I mean, in 2009, the Congress gave the FDA jurisdiction over tobacco, and previous to that, the FDA only could regulate food and drugs that were medicinal, drugs that were marketed as being medicinal and that were produced to be medicinal. The FDA has no jurisdiction over, for example, alcohol or illegal drugs. Those were different agencies, and so the FDA got control in 2009, and Congress said to the FDA, from what I understand, pretty much you can do whatever you want, but one thing you cannot do is eliminate nicotine entirely from cigarettes. And so the FDA is not eliminating nicotine entirely, but they're proposing to eliminate almost all the nicotine. And that would be similar to eliminating all the caffeine in coffee or all the alcohol in beer or wine or anything like that. I think tobacco and cigarettes would be completely uninteresting and unsatisfying, although some people disagree with me. Some people say that you could eliminate the nicotine from cigarettes and people would keep smoking. I think Audrey Silk, for example, might believe that, and I think Frank Davis actually might believe that. But I would say I've read some history, and evidently, even in the 19th century, there were some cigarettes marketed which were denicotinized, and they did not succeed. People just didn't like them. And of course, then you also had the light cigarettes, which anybody who likes what's called a full-flavored cigarette could not really enjoy. I mean, they did not have the same, you could not get the same satisfaction from them as you could from a regular cigarette, or what's called a full-flavored cigarette. So I believe if the FDA, God forbid, goes through with this proposal, it would be a very, very unpleasant thing for anybody who enjoys tobacco. Could put the tobacco companies out of business, might encourage a lot of illicit dealing in tobacco, which would not bother me, but the illicit dealing, but I'm just not sure what would happen. So it's a very large experiment, and it comes very, very close to a total prohibition on smoking in the United States. And of course, if the United States does something like this, there is a global network of tobacco control zealots and officials, and it would probably be something that would reverberate around the world. But we'll see what happens. And of course, as we've all noted many times, the tobacco control movement, even though it has had a great deal of success in terms of coercing and forcing people to stop smoking, is still way, way behind schedule, because they had, in the United States, all of these large organizations and government groups had put up a paper which said that their goal was to eliminate smoking by the year 2000. And of course, right now, we still have about 40 million people, 40 million adults in the United States who have been subjected to a withering campaign of high taxation, stigmatization, being forced not to be able to smoke in restaurants or bars or even their own homes. So we've seen these people resisting and continuing to enjoy tobacco, and I'm sure this must get people in the tobacco control conglomerate very, very angry. So they're continuing to ratchet up their coercive measures, and this FDA measure is very, very strong. Now, one thing I was interested in seeing on Facebook, and I think Audrey Silk posted it, was that there has been in a certain part of Canada where they have banned smoking not only in mental hospitals but on the grounds thereof, and have said to people that if you check yourself into a mental hospital and you go out for a cigarette, then you're automatically discharged. So they've really denying basically medical services to people simply because they smoke. There has been a whole group of at least 70 professionals in the field of mental health who have really, really written a letter to the authorities in Canada saying that this goes way beyond encouraging or discouraging and becomes coercive to the point of denying medical coverage to people simply as a way of bludgeoning them into a more docile and what you would say is a compliant way of living. And so we're seeing even in the public health community and in the mental health profession particularly, there is some pushback, which of course is very good, because I think really tobacco is one of the greatest medicines for people who are suffering difficulties in life, whether they be soldiers fighting in the trenches or people just dealing with the general issues that we all have to deal with day to day. I think tobacco is a very mild psychoactive medication that can help people deal with these things and without resorting to psychoactive pharmaceuticals who nobody knows what their very, very long-term effects are. And we also know that many of these psychoactive medications have some very unpleasant side effects and can even cause people to commit suicide, which of course no one has ever even accused tobacco of doing. Well, we've been talking a lot on this program also about the cognitive enhancement qualities of tobacco, and I thought I would go to my smoker of the week today, which is who was, I think he's no longer with us, a very famous painter who went under the name Balthus, and he was, I'd say 10 or 15 years ago, interviewed in the New York Times. And this is Balthus here enjoying a cigarette on his, I guess, his patio. He's 88 years old here in this particular photo. And he's quoted in the New York Times as saying, "I was born in this century, but I belong much more to the 19th century," says Balthazar Hosowski, known to the world as the painter Balthus. A chain smoker, he keeps a cigarette in the corner of his mouth even when he talks. "You don't smoke?" he asks at one point. Then, with a dismissive arch of his eyebrows, answer himself, "No, of course not. You're American." Well, this was an interview in the New York Times in the year 1996. But I think it was interesting also in a book that I referred to called Daily Rituals, How Artists Work. Balthus is quoted as saying, "I've always painted while smoking. I intuitively understood that smoking doubled my faculty of concentration, allowing me to be entirely within the canvas." So we can see that unlike other drugs like alcohol or marijuana or things of that nature, tobacco not only does not impair your judgment or interfere with your ability to, let's say, write a paper or write a book, but according to many people like Balthus, it actually helps him create. And I mean, I wonder, last week I was talking to Russ about Russ Turnquist, and we were talking about musicians like, well, even in the rock field, like the Stones or Led Zeppelin or Eric Clapton. They all, particularly in their formative years, when they played music, when they created music, smoked and used tobacco very much as a way to enhance the creative process. And I was interested in seeing that Balthus was someone who noted that himself. Well, another thing that's come up, and I think that other people have pointed out, is that now that a lot of smoking bans have been implemented and social norms have been changed, a word I don't like very much, norms, that even the people in the anti-smoking movement are saying that the secondhand smoke was really just an excuse to make it very, very difficult for smokers to find a place to smoke and to get the public in a situation where the public didn't like smoke. So one study that is being noted here is in 2013, a study in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute which has a long-standing bias against tobacco. But this particular study published and peer-reviewed in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute, found there was no link between lung cancer and passive smoking. So after years and years of big signs being put up and anti-smokers saying that secondhand smoke caused lung cancer, a very large study published in one of the most prestigious journals in the world said that basically there is no evidence that all of these studies, if they found any increase in lung cancer in people who are exposed to secondhand smoke, it was so small that it could have been just random. And then, of course, there's what's called publishing bias, whereby studies that come up with no positive finding, like they don't find an increase, don't get published because obviously it's not a story. It's not something that people are interested in. Like I noticed recently in the last few years with the introduction of electronic cigarettes, that the newspapers like to run with a story, oh, teenagers are picking up vaping like crazy. Well, really they're not. They're just a small increase in the actual number, but since the basic number is so small, any increase looks like a large percentage. But this is the nature of the news, this is the nature of reporting, is that people want to hear stories where there's scary stuff going on, where the world is going to hell in a handbasket. Those are the stories that sell. Newspapers are forced, simply by human nature, to print up and to be always trying to find something to stir up and agitate. And again, in the scientific field, when a study does not come up with, if you have 20 studies and 16 of them find no increase in lung cancer or heart disease associated with secondhand smoke, and 4 do, it's the 4 that do that will get published and get the attention, and then of course the newspapers will run with them. And another thing that a study that was very much touted was a study that was done in Helena, Montana, where supposedly after after the implementation of a smoking ban, a lot of people, the rate of heart disease fell back very, very much, and this got a tremendous amount of publicity. But later studies, which were done with much larger population bases, found absolutely no decrease in heart attacks or deaths from heart disease associated with the implementation of smoking bans. But of course, that is not really the kind of news that sells papers, so none of that got into the mainstream consciousness. And I think a lot of this is very well summed up by a professor of public health at Boston University, a man named Michael Siegel, who has been pretty antagonistic towards smoking and has wanted to see a reduction in smoking rates, etc. But he does have certain principles, and one of those principles is that public health, even if it is well-intentioned, must respect the rights of the individual citizen and must not go beyond certain lines of coercion. It's all right to encourage, it's all right to discourage, but when public health and people in public health, some of whom I think are very much prone to what I would call power intoxication. The more power they get, the more they want to wield. Michael Siegel said something that I thought was very, very apropos of the entire anti-smoking movement, and it says, the tobacco control movement has crossed the line from interventions to change social norms to policies that directly stigmatize smokers, interfere unduly with their lives, and violate core public health principles. And I think we are seeing this in so many ways. I think when I started the program tonight, I was talking about, in effect, denying people vital and life-saving medical care unless they kowtowed and stopped smoking. I mean, that's an example that really physicians should never do. They should never, according to the Hippocratic oath, they should first of all do no harm. So denying someone care because that person doesn't follow your prescriptions is what I would think Michael Siegel is talking about when he's talking about violating core public health principles. And another one is, of course, something that went into effect, I think, sometime this month, which is the ban on smoking in public housing all over the United States, where people are denied the freedom or the liberty to smoke even in their own apartments. Many of these people are elderly, some of them are disabled, many of them suffer from anxiety disorders and the like, and many find smoking a very, very comforting and pleasant aspect of their lives. But again, this tobacco control movement, which has essentially captured public health, captured much of the government, is now saying that they cannot smoke in their own apartments, and they will be threatened with eviction if they don't kowtow again. And I'm glad to see that Audrey Silk in New York City Clash, is challenging this on a legal basis, and we will see what happens with that, and whether or not the lawsuit or whether or not Audrey Silk prevails. At least it will be a forum for people to discuss these issues and discuss how far and to what extent public health has the right to coerce citizens. Well, thank you for watching the smoking section. I hope you watch next week.